The teachings of Osho present themselves as a path to freedom, awareness, and peace, yet they contain a deep ethical flaw that makes them corrosive and, ultimately, irresponsible. At the heart of this flaw is a conception of spirituality that seeks tranquility by dissolving responsibility rather than by confronting and integrating it. While Osho's language is seductive, filled with promises of liberation from guilt, repression, and inner conflict, it achieves this calm by neutralizing moral agency and reframing ethical failure as mere unconsciousness. What emerges is not spiritual maturity, but a refined form of moral evasion. Osho repeatedly emphasized the role of the witness, encouraging individuals to observe their thoughts, desires, and actions without judgment. In itself, self-awareness is not problematic. It is a foundational practice in many serious spiritual traditions. The issue lies in how this witnessing is severed from accountability. When action is treated as something that simply happens through conditioning, biology, or unconscious forces, the individual is subtly relieved of responsibility for the consequences of their behavior. Harm becomes an event rather than a choice, and wrongdoing becomes a psychological phenomenon rather than a moral one. This framing may reduce inner conflict, but it does so by evacuating the very concept of responsibility that gives ethical life its meaning. This reduction of ethics into clinical observation transforms spirituality into something closer to emotional anesthesia than moral awakening. Osho's insistence on non-judgment and neutrality collapses the distinction between discernment and repression, as if all moral judgment were merely egoic interference. Yet moral life cannot function without judgment. Compassion requires the recognition that something is wrong and ought to be addressed. Justice requires the ability to say that certain actions should not have occurred. By treating judgment itself as a spiritual failure, Osho replaces ethical engagement with detached spectatorship. The result is awareness without obligation, clarity without courage. The peace promised by this framework is therefore deeply suspect. It is not the peace that follows repentance, repair, or reconciliation, but a peace achieved by dissolving the inner structures that register guilt, conflict, and moral tension in the first place. Conscience is reframed as social conditioning, remorse as neurosis, and moral struggle as repression. In this way, ethical discomfort is not worked through, but bypassed. The individual feels calm, not because harm has been acknowledged or addressed, but because the inner mechanisms that would demand responsibility have been disarmed. This is a peace that soothes the self while leaving the moral world untouched. Osho's radical emphasis on individual freedom further compounds the problem. Enlightenment is portrayed as a purely personal achievement, detached from social obligation or communal accountability. When personal authenticity is elevated above all external norms, the question of how one's actions affect others becomes secondary or irrelevant. This creates fertile ground for exploitation, especially in hierarchical or charismatic settings. Power imbalances are easily ignored when harm can always be attributed to the victim's lack of awareness or spiritual immaturity. Responsibility flows downward, never upward, and authority remains insulated from critique. What makes this especially troubling is that the philosophy does not merely tolerate ego, it protects it. Desires are recast as natural truth, impulses as spontaneous wisdom, and avoidance of responsibility as transcendence. Rather than dismantling the ego, this approach refines it, granting it spiritual legitimacy while shielding it from moral evaluation. The individual is no longer accountable to ethical standards, traditions, or even other people, only to an internal sense of authenticity that cannot be questioned without being labeled unconscious or repressed. Genuine spirituality, however, does not abolish responsibility. It intensifies it. Awareness deepens moral perception rather than dissolving it. Peace is not found by escaping judgment, but by facing the weight of one's actions and responding with integrity. Moral struggle is not a defect to be eliminated, but a sign that conscience is alive and engaged. Any spiritual framework that consistently resolves ethical tension by denying agency does not liberate the human being, it infantilizes them. Osho's ideas are ethically corrosive, precisely because they offer a shortcut to peace, one that avoids the hard work of accountability, repair, and moral growth. By separating awareness from responsibility, they create a calm that feels profound, but functions as abdication. What remains is not enlightenment, but a tranquilized conscience, mistaking detachment for wisdom and neutrality for virtue.